Sarah, I'd love to talk about this story out of Connecticut because it hits rather close to home as someone who was homeschooled by my Catholic family up until high school. Then I went to an all-boys Catholic high school after that. Kind of got me ready for college with being in more of a group, sort of more structured social setting and educational setting in that way. So I'm glad that's kind of the path I took. It worked for me. But this story out of Connecticut is talking about increased documentation required for homeschooling, and essentially that they want more government oversight. Families have to file in-person paperwork before beginning to homeschool. They have to provide annual documentation of their children's educational progress. And this is essentially coming after a long time of a very hands-off approach in Connecticut to homeschooling regulation. And they're framing this as essentially this sort of government oversight, almost a police state atmosphere of monitoring what the kids do year to year in education. And it's interesting to me because here in the People's Republic of New York, this is what we had to do growing up. This is going back 20 years now, is that we had to provide, my family had to provide annual kind of updates. I'm pretty sure I had to take tests now and then even to kind of show that I was getting the bare minimums. Yeah. And so I understand the perspective of these folks in Connecticut who are used to not needing to do this and feeling very, sort of put upon, very oppressed by this measure that is being proposed. But in a certain sense, I'm not really, I can't find myself that opposed to the government just wanting, annual updates. I feel like that's not too much to ask. But if they're framing it as a precedent being set for further crackdowns on homeschooling and on people's ability to homeschool, I can definitely see the opposition there.
I think that what really becomes a problem, and this is the case in some states, where the state wants to evaluate exactly what's being taught in the school. And at that point, it's like, well, the whole reason they're not in the public schools is because they don't want to teach the exact same thing.
Exactly, yeah.
And so if a parent wants to try some other approach or take some other program, because oftentimes homeschoolers do go through like established programs, so you don't have to sort of reinvent the wheel with your child. I don't think that you need the state sort of overseeing and saying, no, it's, too early to study Western civilization, or whatever it happens to be. I think that there needs to be a hands-off approach to that. The reasoning behind so many of these increases is that there's serious abusers like to take their kids out of public school and allegedly homeschool them, which actually just means that they don't homeschool them at all. Yeah. And so that's the attempt. And I understand that, but in all the cases that I've seen, and I haven't really kept up with this actually, it's been something of an area of concern for me. Is that when you see these cases, so you have a child who's being abused, and suddenly they're taken out of school, and the parents say they're going to homeschool, and then they actually don't, and then you have a child who ends up being killed. Yeah. Multiple stories like this. But what also happens at the same time is that CPS is called repeatedly while the kid is at public school, then usually by the neighbors thereafter, and repeatedly the Child Protective Services fails in its duty to actually intervene at all in any of these cases, and therefore it escalates. I'm not convinced in the argument that if you simply have these homeschoolers file an annual documentation, that somehow that would stop kids from being abused. I don't think that's the case at all. You would just have those abusive parents would just file the documentation if they needed to and continue abusing the child. Yeah, exactly. And Ralph Rodriguez in the Federalist, who testified before the Connecticut Education Committee against this bill, his article over here at thefederalist.com, he mentions some of these studies about protecting kids. He cites studies by multiple researchers that examine the relationship between homeschooling and child welfare outcomes, and they've found no statistically significant connection between home education and elevated rates of abuse or neglect. And he says that decades of analysis by bodies such as the U.S. Commission to Eliminate Child Abuse and Neglect Fatalities have never identified homeschooling as a risk factor for child maltreatment. The actual demographic predictors of child maltreatment are well established. Families experiencing domestic abuse, substance abuse, poverty, social isolation, schooling type is not among those demographic predictors. So there's really no real statistical
backing for this argument about it. And that's why I say the stand on principle against needing this kind of oversight, I definitely sympathize with it, even though I think from a homeschooling point of view, I mean, when you're talking about ideals, I think really who needs to be helping with education is the church. Back in the old days, that's what you had. You had these church schools, these Catholic schools that helped with education, at least in the modern era, so to speak, the last few hundred years, up until recently, up until the last decade, when we saw such a collapse in church religious life. The church was the leader on education and on medical treatment. And these things, the education and medical fields, have now become industries, which is the main problem, is the fact that they get referred to as industries. That in itself is terrible. In that they used to be the church who helped provide support and took the burden off of families needing to educate their kids directly in that way. But the church has also always said that is the fundamental basis for education, is a parent responsible for raising their kids, teaching them in the faith. That goes right back to the Holy Family, and how even St. Joseph, as we discussed last week, taught God himself, our Lord Jesus Christ, in the faith as the father. That's the father's duty, is to teach his children, and for the mother to assist the father in that duty, especially when the father is off working to provide. So the principle, the Catholic principle of homeschooling, even if I do think that there's a position to take where ideally you get these Catholic schools that would support kids and help raise them in the faith, really sometimes the most reliable way to get your children taught in the faith is just to do it yourself. That's the only way you can ensure that they get taught the right things, even compared to a Catholic school. And I experienced this in my Catholic high school as much as I loved going there. So.
Well, I'm friends with several teachers who teach sort of up to 8th grade collectively, and all of them will tell you that the biggest thing that makes a difference in the faith of the children is what kind of home they come from.
Yep.
They can't impart the faith by themselves. They can teach about the saints and so on, and they do, but that doesn't actually, give the faith and pass it on. And so that's the important part in terms of the faith itself. But I do think that there's a merit or validity, if you like, in this sort of group environment of different Catholic kids of different ages, being there together, whether you accomplish that through sort of networks of homeschoolers or whether you do it through an actual established Catholic school that has the potential of really great teachers coming in. That's the sort of one of the benefits of that. But I have to look at the output of diocesan schools over the past several decades.
Oh yes, that's
just that's just a kind of dumpster fire in which those who are, I think that when they get to the age of 23, over half have left the faith. Mm-hmm. So again, yes, there's also that home life aspect that it's very difficult statistically to figure out. Was the problem the school? Was the problem the home life? Or was it that the school failed? There's a lot that's going on there altogether. Yeah. But I can't look at Catholic schools and see them as a sort of antidote to much of anything.
No, the real...
That's been the case. Go ahead.
The importance is providing that alternative right now, and that's what homeschooling is. Homeschooling is this essential alternative for families who want to ensure as best as possible that they can transmit the faith to their children. That's the main reason for defending access to it all throughout the United States.
Yes, and I think that those who argue against homeschooling are often really arguing specifically against a religious upbringing, and that's one of the things that we can't really forget. That often it's a secular understanding of, well, you can't raise people religiously because that's indoctrination,
Exactly.
But yet if we teach them our secular stuff, that isn't indoctrination at all. Yeah.